Thank you guys for coming out at 4 on is it Friday? Saturday. I don't know what day it is. It's hard to do. It's before you've had your drinks, so my jokes aren't quite as funny. And it's that time in the afternoon where you might fall asleep. So if you do, that's totally fine. It's okay. We will all pause and do an Instagram live of it to my 1 million followers. So just don't worry about it. That's going to be that's the penance for that. There is a little bit of adult language in this, so I hope you guys don't mind the occasional F-bomb. I'll try to keep it to a minimum, but I won't try to keep it to a minimum. That's a total lie. So anyway, this is, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Cory Richards. I was a National Geographic photographer. I was a professional athlete, and I focused primarily on high-altitude climbing for a long time. Today, it's not about mountains, although we're going to use some mountains to go on a journey. It's much more about an internal journey and how we form our stories and the stories we tell and how they form us. But before we get to that, I'm just going to give you a little bit of just beauty to settle you into where we are. And the whole show goes downhill from here. I just show the best up front, and that's how I get you in your seat. No, I want to start at the beginning with my mother, because that's where the beginning is. I always like to reference the fact that every egg a woman is born with, or every egg a woman will ever have, she is born with, which means on some fundamental level that all of us were with our mothers for the entirety of their lives. Everything that ever happened to them, everything they ever went through, all of that is in some ways with us because they carry us that whole time. And I think that's just a very special acknowledgement to make. It's sacred in some ways because all it takes is one creep to come along, like this guy, my dad, also 19 years old, reading Playboy on top of the Grand Teton. So this is, I think, the late 50s here, licking his lips. And then they crash together, the chance of which is about 1 in 20,000. And the chance that they have a child is about 1 in 2,000. So you see the amplification of how rare it is. And I know these numbers because my dad was a math teacher. And so this is a story about family and the interwoven dynamics of that and how that pushes us forward in life and how it generates who we become. And I was born fucking awesome. I was very sophisticated from jump. I already crossed my legs. That's actually me the day after I was born. So just inquisitive, looking at the world like, how can I mess with all of you? But really, I show this because it's sort of indicative of our young life. We grew up in the outdoors. My parents were very into backpacking. They met at a ski resort. They were both climbers. And so this was deeply ingrained in our childhood. And they were both in education. So they believed that education were this equal parts sort of experience and learning, right? And our young life was in many ways an Eden. We started skiing when we were 2. We started climbing when we were 5. And I have one sibling, my older brother, David. And as much as I would say the sort of pivotal relationships of our lives are with our parents, I think my relationship with my brother has been undoubtedly the most impactful. And as we were children, there was this kinship, but as we started to grow into adolescence, for a number of different reasons, things started to unwind or unravel. And I really go deep into that psychology in the book. What happens specifically as a result of postpartum depression early on and early childhood development, and how much that imprints how we attach to people later on and how we seek out the attention that we need, the emotional bonds that we need. And so that's a complicated story, but I'm going to condense it. As we started to get into our adolescence, and certainly there's some sibling rivalry that's present, that relationship became very, very violent. Both of us were gifted students. I went to high school 2 years early, was getting straight A's, and by the time I was 12, I was nearly failing. And I always remember this sense that I was on the outside looking in, even when I was this big. I always felt a certain sense of almost dissociation from the world, right? I was trying to reach in and touch it, but I always felt on the outside. And I actually think that is a relatively common human experience. I mean, we do navigate the world in our own isolation in some ways. And I think part of that journey is trying to reconnect. But that feeling for me was so present. And the other thing that amplified it was the fact that my mind was incredibly fast. I remember that from being tiny. I was like, and almost two thoughts overlapping, like bouncing around and then stepping back and being like, how can my brain move this fast between different things? And sort of an astonishing sort of wave of energy that will wash over me as I couldn't control it. And there were two things that really calmed that down. It was nature, being in nature, and art. And those were the ways that I could calm it. But anyways, this violence at home started to amplify. My grades started to drop. And that got noticed. And then I started to see a psychiatrist and a psychologist. And if you don't know the difference, you're killing it in life. But I was 12 the first time I was medicated. And I was medicated, it was banner years for SSRIs. I was put on Prozac. And that started this long journey with mental health. Coincidentally, my mom took me to see my first psychologist when I was 1. So this story starts very, very young. And after, I think I was 13, I had stopped going to school basically. And my mom said, can we take you to the hospital to get an evaluation? And I knew something was wrong, and so I agreed to it, and we went in, and as we were leaving, I had this conversation with the therapist, and then as we were leaving, this man came up and said, hey, are you Cory Richards? And she said, yes, and he said, a bed just opened up. And I realized, oh, I'm not leaving. And I heard the door kind of lock, and the sense of just abandonment was so profound. And a week later, they put me in a long-term care facility in North Salt Lake called Lifeline, where I stayed for 8 months. And I'm always, I went back later and I took pictures of the place, and I was like, is this the environment that we're trying to heal children in? It seems very odd that that would be a healing environment, you know what I mean? But the curious thing about this is where I completely went off the rails. They thought that this was going to keep me safe. I ran away 3 times. This is where I was diagnosed with bipolar 2, heavily medicated, almost to the point of being sedated. And it was also here that I started my journey, my short journey into homelessness. Because the last time I ran away, my parents were just like, okay, you've shown us that this isn't working. So we're not going to fight it anymore, but you don't have a place to live. And I remember sitting across the street from my house at night in the sort of shade of a tree and watching a locksmith just change all the locks on the home. And wondering in a really deep way, like, where do I belong? Do I belong? Do I have value? How can the people that are supposed to love me the most not want me at all? That was the story I was telling myself. There was another story going on, but we're going to get back to that too. And this time period was, I think, one of, probably the darkest of my life. It was also where I learned a lot of skills that would become actually very valuable in what I decided to do. You see this young life unraveling, and there's a lot of chaos. You're moving, you're not wanted, you're on the street, and this, again, imprints on the mind, and we're building these stories. You also learn hypervigilance. You learn how to navigate very, very complicated situations. You learn how to order chaos. And this actually works very well with the mind that was already fast, right? After about 2 years of this quasi-homelessness, while sometimes I was on the street, mostly kept off by family friends, I ended up back in the hospital. And the therapists bring us in for a family counseling session, and they say, we've got a great solution. It's a great program for your kid. It's going to sort everything out. It's called Lifeline. And my parents were like, did you read the file? Like, he was already there. That's the problem, right? And we sort of realized that the system was not working. The system in itself was functionally flawed. And it was the first time that they said, what do you need? I remember it so clearly. They're like, I felt for the very first time as an adolescent considered, not put upon. Now, I know that we need to guide our children. I'm not saying that they can always just guide us, but I was shocked. And I said, I'd like to move to Seattle with my aunt and uncle. And they took me in. And it was there that some level of stasis came back into my life. And it was there that I rediscovered climbing. And climbing then became the way that I expressed myself. The other way that I was able to express myself, and it was during this period that I discovered photography. Because what happened was my uncle, every paycheck that would come in, because I had to have money to go climbing. It was the only thing that gave me motivation to keep a job, right? And so a paycheck would come in, a very meager paycheck, by the way, but I thought I was killing it. And he would ask for half, sort of for rent. And I'd give it to him. And then after living with them for about a year, he said, I'm going to give you all of your money back if you choose an experience to spend it on. And there was only one thing that I could imagine I wanted to do with that. I wanted to climb. And it was right before I took that trip that I called my mom because she's the beginning of everything, and said, "Can I borrow your camera?" And she said, "Of course you can." It was a 1984 Ricoh point and shoot. And I remember turning in my first page of slides to Patagonia. And I get this lovely letter back from the editor, and she says, "Cory, these are great. We don't have any use for them right now. Please keep shooting, keep submitting. P.S. I think you can turn off the date and time feature in your camera." Because every slide had like this orange just burn mark across, and I was like, oh shit. All right. But anyway, climbing and photography then became everything. I breathed it. I felt the most at home there. My mind was quiet. And all of a sudden, I was using these tools, these skills that I had developed during these very tumultuous years. Hypervigilance. This is a pretty good place to be hypervigilant. Managing chaos. Pretty good place to manage chaos. So it was actually directing these things into a very productive and generative output. And then the art became this way to sort of reflect it back and understand myself in some deeper way. Because what I was fascinated with is what we're actually capable of. But when I look back, I see that all of this is in some way a survival extension, an extension of living in survival mode. This is a high stimulation way to live, right? The climbs got bigger. My ego got a lot bigger. I got away with a lot more. And I started publishing more. And I think in some ways this is when I started to understand that I had a story that my mind was dangerous. That if I stopped, if I stood still too long, I was inevitably going to go crazy. Because that's sort of what I had been taught. You go off your medication, you're going to go crazy, you know? You don't manage this perfectly, you're going to be on the street. And there was evidence in some ways to support that. But again, I don't think that I was really ready to... I mean, first of all, I think that story was flawed. But I started to see that the extension of that history was that I was willing to risk my life in order to save it. That was my solution to sort of outrunning a madness that I thought was always there. And yes, it's kind of crazy to think about it. Because you're never in climbing, the more you do it, the more you're like, well, at least in my case, it's like, well, if one's good, 1,000 would be great, right? So you're looking for more and more difficult things, and ultimately you start looking for things that have never been done. Because that's sort of that's the peak of climbing, is to do first ascents. So this was a first ascent we did in the Canadian Rockies. And again, sleeping in parks became this skill that was translatable, right? This is on a snow ledge. Take a good look. It's cozy, right? We do a lot of man-spooning in this sport. Brokeback Glacier. You can take it as far as you want. But I just want you to note, it looks nice. That second green dot, that's where we're sleeping in that last photo. So it's just tucked in back behind this ice fall. And the photos proved in some way that I existed. And this was the thing that was so important for me in this life is I had felt through that time period that I didn't belong anywhere. And that potentially my value as a human was somehow diminished. And that there was this fundamental flaw in me, right? And so the photographs were this tether that allowed me to kind of point my name out, right? I was seeking validation. I wanted it. I was thirsty for it. And I stayed thirsty for it for a long time. I could be like, look, I matter. And that helped me sort of keep out of this feeling of deficit, or so I thought. But it wasn't actually the climbing photographs that really moved me the most. As I started getting sponsored, paid for the pictures, I could go on bigger trips. And the bigger trips took me to different places. And I started looking around and being more curious about that world. And I always had this sense that if I looked hard enough at anything, a rock, a leaf, a person, if I looked hard enough, past the physical form, I could see myself. This idea that we are all interwoven in one thing, this random cascade of atoms, had always been with me. But this really wasn't what I was paid for at the time. I was paid to go on big expeditions and climb big things and take pictures. And the truth is, I was never a really talented climber. The people I climbed with, bless you, the people I climbed with were always more talented, but it was my camera that allowed me into that venue. I remember this photograph on the north face of a mountain called Quang De Char on a first ascent with a brilliant climber named Ines Papert. Coming around the shoulder, we had been on this face for about 5 days. And I looked out and I saw Everest and Nuptse and Lhotse, the fourth highest, Ama Dablam, Makalu, and a mountain called Tavoche over here. And it was like a time warp looking into my future, or at least what I wanted my future to be. And within 3 years, I had, we had done a new route on Tavoche. We had tried to climb Nuptse. I had climbed Lhotse, climbed Ama, and failed on Makalu. So about a 50% success rate. And this just became my life. I would go to Nepal 3 times a year. I should have just gotten a house there. Because I'd get there, it's basically spending 6 months of the year or more in Nepal, and it was what was sustaining me. The photographs, selling them to sponsors, was what sort of kept me afloat. And again, I thought I was killing it. And then in the spring of 2010, I went to help a guy named Jim Baylog install cameras for his extreme ice survey, which looked at glacial recession, deflation in the Himalaya. And I managed to sneak my way in to get a permit for Lhotse, which is the 4th highest mountain in the world. And I hadn't acclimatized, but I got on the permit with this guy, Motoko, and we ended up climbing Lhotse. And this is actually Everest right here. So it's basically almost a sub-peak. This is the trip that I met a guy named Simone Moro on. This is Simone. He's Italian. He looks hard, right? Like that is a hardened face of a criminal. Basically, he's a serial killer, I think. Until you hear him talk. And then he talk like this the whole time. He's Italian, very high pitch, like this, no shit. And I remember him telling me this story. Excuse my language. He's like, Cory, you must come to Italy, most beautiful beaches in the world. I said, excuse me, Simone? Most beautiful beaches I've ever seen. And I was like, oh, beaches. You mean beaches. Like the beaches in Italy are great. I was like, that's great. So it was him and another guy named Dennis Arupko that invited me to try to climb the 13th highest mountain in the world in winter, which sounds stupid, I admit. And I didn't know how dumb it would be. There are 14 mountains in the world that are higher than 8,000 meters, which is about 26,240 feet, right? One of them's in India, 8 of them are on the border of Nepal and Tibet, and 5 of them are in Pakistan. All of those south of Pakistan by this time had been climbed in winter. The Polish started climbing the 8,000 meter peaks in winter back in the 80s. But because the Karakoram Himalaya in Pakistan is about 600 miles further north, it's incredibly cold and incredibly windy in the winter. I didn't know really any of this. These were my 2 Himalayan heroes asking me to go on an expedition and take photographs. And the original plan wasn't even for me to go to the top. Simone was the guy that brought me in. And Dennis, being Russian, was the guy that was like, but Simone, why we bring stupid American boy? Is not strong. I'm like, bro, I'm right here. Like, I can hear you. And he's like, but Cory, men talking, just shut me up. Like, you just calm down, little boy, right? And after about 6 weeks, on February 2nd, we woke up in the tent. We were making our summit bid. There was about a 12-hour weather window where the jet stream moved off the top. And I remember waking up in the tent that morning, grabbing the altimeter that was hanging from the ceiling of the tent, 3 guys in a sardine can basically, and looking at the temperature, and it was minus 51. And it's about 11 o'clock, maybe midnight, and we step out of the tent and we start climbing. And we're either going to make it to the summit that day or not. But this is where my mind functions best, because this is where it slows down, because there's this severity to it. It was as if I was chasing survival, because that's where my mind could actually be at peace, which is actually the inverse of the way it really works. That only works for a very short moment. So we left the tent, we started climbing through the night, and the sun started to come up. I see that the sun is just peeking over, and I run ahead of Simone and Dennis at this point on fairly level ground. And I turned around and I took this photo, and I immediately started dry heaving. Because first of all, running in crampons, the spikes on the bottom of your feet, it's just like this weird thing, you know? And then I just bent over and started dry heaving. But this photo became a very symbolic moment of this climb and certainly my life. And a couple hours later, we were here, just below the summit, and I realized, oh my God, this is happening. This is going to happen. And the last few steps were actually quite silent in my mind, even though it was very windy by this point. You can see that there starts to be this sort of powder gray behind, which is the jet stream moving back in. And we were only on the summit for a few minutes before really realizing that we were already at risk, but we had sort of extended it too far. And so we started down, and as we did, the storm really hit the mountain, and we're getting gusts of about 100 kilometers an hour, so 60 miles an hour, and we just barely make it back to the tent. At that point, Dennis's eyes had frozen, like literally he took off his goggles because they were too fogged, which is a terrible idea. And now you've got sort of snow blindness, and his eyes are freezing shut. And just before dark, we made it back to the tent. And then the next day, we were like, well, we'll probably make it back to base camp. We didn't. It had snowed so much that it started, the avalanche danger had become very, very high. And the storm was so intense that navigating it down, what we thought was going to take 4 hours took 12 until we got back down to Camp 1, which seemed like a safe place to be. And then the next morning we got up, and I just had this feeling, I was like, this doesn't feel good, but what am I going to do? Like build a house here? You know, like we have to go down. And so we left the tent and started down. And it was directly after this, I took this video, I heard it, I knew what it was, and it was just sounded like sort of like a low thunder. And I looked up to my right, and I saw the cloud coming out of the avalanche coming out of the cloud ceiling, and I just yelled, run, which is stupid when you look at it. Like, run, and you're like trying to, you take one step, and then it just went black. And as the snow hit us, a million things go through your mind, right? Like, your life does flash before your eyes, but it's not poetic. It's not the way it's written. It's like the most random shit you've ever thought about. I'm thinking about Cheerios. I'm thinking about parking tickets. I'm thinking about things I wish I could unsay. I'm thinking and time just elongates and floods with this Polaroid and fragments of memory. So it's true that your life flashes before your eyes, but it's not some beautiful, there's no symphony playing to it, right? The strings are not present. It's just loud and quiet at the same time. And in avalanches, they're so chaotic that you feel it's like this black and white as you're toppling, And then I just started to feel my body getting pulled deeper down by my own weight, and it gets darker and darker and darker. And right as we started to slow down, I threw my arm up, and I ended up buried on the surface like this. And my first thought is Dennis and Simone are dead. I'm going to have to untie from the rope. I'm going to follow it to the place where I can't pull it anymore. I'm going to have to dig with bare hands because I don't have a shovel, and they'll be too deep. And I'm going to have to untie and walk down alone because they're dead. And I started moving and wriggling and trying to get out of this. And, and then I heard the most annoying, best voice in the world. Cory, everything is okay. And I'm like, I love you. Oh my God, nothing is okay. Like nothing is okay right now. And I felt him starting to dig around me. I felt his hands on me, and he's kind of like holding me but digging around. And then I hear this other voice, hey, Simone, I too am okay. Like very pragmatic Russian. And I'm like, none of us are dead. Somehow we stayed on top. And that's largely due because we were hit on flat ground. So most of what hit us was the actual air blast that comes out in front of the avalanche. And that's why probably we weren't buried. We did get thrown over several crevasses, but we were very, very lucky. And about an hour later, as we were walking down, sort of navigating around these massive, we had all fallen in more crevasses by that time. I was just so exhausted. About an hour after the avalanche, I turned the camera on and I took this picture. And it's me, and I sent it to my mom later, and I said, check this out. And she goes, oh, that's gripping. Who is it? I'm like, it's me when I'm 90, you know. But this picture literally changed everything in my life. It changed the course of it all, for better and worse. And I've had very different relationships with this photograph, because it became the symbol of this, but it's also become the symbol of my inner makeup. Because what I see now is somebody who is fragmented, who is fractured, and doesn't know how to put it back together. And who, in this exact moment, is using pictures as a way to try to glue himself back together. What happens in trauma, especially when we have what's called complex post-traumatic stress, like a chaotic childhood, a violent childhood, lots of trauma as we develop, is our brains become hardwired basically to live in our stress response. We're in our sympathetic nervous system. We're in our amygdala. And there's no future forecasting there, right? And so when we have complex post-traumatic stress, and then we have a major life event, it's much more common to get thrust into post-traumatic stress disorder or an acute episode of it, right? Because our brains are preconditioned for it. And the way PTSD actually works is what's happening is the memory of the event gets lodged in your memory center, and then it keeps your body on high alert, and it short circuits past your prefrontal cortex, which is where all your logic and rational thinking are happening. And it just short circuits between your amygdala, which is where your stress response comes from, and the memory. And you just get stuck like this. And that's what that hum becomes. And that's why people use drugs. And that's why people get angry, because they're trying to escape the sympathetic nervous system. Trying any way to hijack it, right? So this became the condensed version of the first half of my life and what would become the next. But Pakistan also gave me something very, very special as well in terms of pictures, because it was right next to this Pakistani military camp, our base camp. And on our rest days, I would go over to the army camp. And this is protecting the border from India, highest battlefield in the world. And I started to hang out with these soldiers who live in these tiny little igloos. Because mostly I was just bored. And we'd watch Rambo and Full Metal Jacket and Platoon, smoke cigarettes, right? Drink tea. But I forged this very gentle, beautiful relationship with these guys. A lot of our communication was nonverbal, but they were as interested in me as I was in them. So they invited me in. And it was actually these pictures that got me into National Geographic. It wasn't the portrait. It was these ones. Because this was the first collection of pictures that I ever made that were about long-form storytelling. Trying to look at stories in a more holistic way. And that really required me understanding the stories that they were telling me and the stories that they had inherited about their duty, martyrdom, everything. And it really made me question, at least at the very beginning, what stories do we tell that guide everything in our lives? How deep do those layers go? How deep does story run? When I came home from this trip, my life just changed completely, because at least in the climbing world, this was a very significant thing that had happened. It was the first of the Pakistani big peaks to be climbed in winter. I was the first. I'm still the only American to climb one of the 8,000 meter peaks in winter, which I didn't know would be true at the time. So life just sort of skyrocketed. I was 29 years old. I got married, because that's what you do. At least that's the story that I had been told. And beautiful woman, she loved me completely. And I really tried to love her. But truthfully, as you'll see, I wasn't quite ready. Because on the external, my life was doing this dramatic rise. And internally, I started to feel frayed. I started to feel like I was on the outside looking in, and layers of life were overlapping and blurring. I was quick to anger. I was deeply forgetful. And I just wanted anything to kind of get this residue off of me that I couldn't escape. It was almost like tunnel vision, right? And I didn't know the name for it. I didn't know what I knew what PTSD was, but I had no idea that this could actually be that. I knew about my childhood. I knew a lot about mental health at this point, but it was all context. It was just conceptual. And the only thing that I really knew how to do to make it quiet down was to keep working and to keep going into the field. And this would be a pattern that would last for basically 12 years. And the first assignment I ever got for National Geographic was to the Kingdom of Mustang on the border of Nepal and Tibet. And the climbing now, this thing that I had just been given when I was 5, that had become sort of this freedom expression for me, and art as a way to express myself through it, now had sort of become the way that I could actually sustain myself entirely in the world, but also the way that I could forget the rest of the world. But this first assignment was amazing. It was vertical Indiana Jones. We were using climbing to get into these ancient caves. It's like climbing vertical mud, right? And I always point out on this photo, people will be like, "You got the best job in the world. That's so cool." I broke my back trying to get into this cave the year before. And then about 3 minutes after this photo was taken, the rope that Matt was climbing on knocked a boulder about grapefruit size off and collapsed the skull of our cameraman right at the bottom. So now you see this life, high stimulation, high movement, but it's all mirroring what's going on inside of me, right? So now I'm sitting there holding my friend's head as he survived, by the way, but that also has profound impacts on us. I'm adapting myself to high risk. The purpose of this expedition actually was to find burial crypts, to study human migration and a piece of the Silk Road. And it was incredibly successful. As a first article for the magazine, we always said, you're only as good as your last article, right? And this one was good. And so they just started handing me more. I always joke, though, that they like to hand me the crappy ones. They're like, "This sounds terrible. Give it to Cory. He'll do it." And it was true. They sent me directly to Antarctica. And then after that, straight up to the Arctic. And then after that, more mountains, more climbing, one after the next, and then back to the equator, right? And it was all sort of an attempt, in my mind, to keep this thing between my ears quiet. And if I'm being honest, I was never really, I always flew under the flag of like, I'm trying to make a difference in the world. But if I'm being honest, I was just trying to survive. It wasn't about other people, it was about me. And there's no point in denying that now, I see it. But for a long time, it was very dishonest of me to say, oh, this is all about saving the Baojiao or the Arctic. It wasn't about that. It was about me trying to get people to notice me and validate me. But that's not to say that like this work didn't have its benefits, right? It did. It had real impact. Again, people are like, you've got the best job in the world. I'm like, how many times have you had malaria? You know? How many times have you laid in a snowstorm like that and tried to make pictures? It did have great, beautiful output, right? But it also had, it was starting to take a toll anyway on me, because I was living in this heightened stimulation constantly. And every time I'd come back to the city, come back to civilization, this is Hong Kong where my now ex-wife's family lived, I couldn't calm it. And I noticed I was reaching for more and more ways to calm it. Substances, different behaviors that we'll talk about in a minute. So I was craving whatever would come next. I was digging for it. But I also noticed that the more I went into these environments, the harder it became to calm it down. It was as if I was pouring water into a cracked vessel. And I needed more and more water to fill it up. And the next assignment took us to Myanmar, where we took planes and boats and overnight buses, and then finally we took the baby Hells Angels 80 miles into the jungle. I remember this morning I woke up, and these guys were like, they were tough, but these are like 125cc motorbikes, and this guy cracks a beer at 7 in the morning, and I'm like, I get it. It's stressful, it's raining. And then he dumps some out, and I was like, some for the homies, that's cool. And then he cracks a bottle of Cobra whiskey and fills it back up. The part that he was like, I'm riding with that guy. That's gonna be a good day. That's gonna be excellent fun. And after 80 miles with the baby Hells Angels, we walked 125 miles into the jungle. And this is not like, okay, who's walked through a jungle? Okay, yeah, a few of you. Hawaii doesn't count. That's not a jungle. That's going through the jungle is marvelous and the worst thing you've ever done. It is so hot. You've got leeches on you. Every night you go to bed in these huts. You could see like one up there. I would like get tired of reading, and I'd put my book down and I'd look up at the ceiling where my headlamp was, and there's just 1,000 eyes of spiders. And you're just like, this is terrible. This is terrible. I thought mountains were hard. The jungle is very hard.
100 miles of trail, and it's like straight down through bamboo spears to the river.
He stabbed his foot, right?
The Burmese Himalaya is different because of how long the approach is to get there and the lack of infrastructure that's set in place.
The whole time I felt like I was trying to prove myself. It's like this crazy toughness that I feel like I have to have. So I think we're on day 3 of hiking, and these are the longest days at 16 miles each. You know, it's like, I'm not gonna like be weak. It's such a stupid thing.
It's just not set up for expeditions. There's no porters. There's not even any food.
And as we got deeper into the jungle, the bridges became less of a bridge. And finally, the trail disappeared altogether. And after about 30 days, we finally found the mountain that we had come to climb and we had come to measure. It's called Kakabo Razi. And it had only been climbed once before. But the route that we were trying to take was very, very confusing. And by this point, I was feeling very exposed, meaning that the weight that I had been carrying for so many years was starting to sort of bubble up, and it was expressing outwardly at this point. And because we were so exhausted, I just felt like I was getting, I don't know, more and more and more raw. But finally, we actually started climbing, and it was some of the most beautiful climbing I've really ever done. It wasn't that hard, but it was stunning.
This might be one of the most beautiful camps I've ever had the pleasure to stay at.
So that's Hillary Nelson who was saying that. Hillary's now no longer with us. And that's one of the things that I started to become more and more aware of, is more and more friends were actually dying around me. So the reality of my own sort of mortality became more and more profound as I did this. After 41 days of climbing, we realized, we got to about here. And we realized that we had overextended ourselves, we had overestimated ourselves, and underestimated the objective, and we were forced to turn around, which normally wouldn't be that big of a deal. But I was also aware that things in my life back home were starting to unravel. I was very aware that all the time on the road, if I wasn't climbing, I was speaking, that they were having a toll on my relationship. And we still had to walk 125 miles back through the jungle without rolling papers, and we started pulling them out of books. That's actually from Finding George Orwell in Burma, that page. And we got back to the trailhead, and I looked like a really happy person, just psyched. Everybody's still coming up, you got the best job in the world. And I'm like, look at this. You know, like, how do I look? I look like an inmate. I knew I was crumbling, and I knew my marriage was failing, and that sense of being on the outside looking in started to grow into a profound sense of fundamental isolation, as if I couldn't connect. I couldn't connect to anybody or anything. But rather than addressing it, I kept going because it was all I knew how to do. And I could hide behind the prestige of being a photographer for National Geographic. I'm so cool, right? And it was cool. They called and asked if I'd go to Angola, the Angolan highlands. Angola had been in a civil war for 30 years. And now my work was expanding. You know, I wasn't just climbing anymore, and that's what I wanted. I wanted to break outside of it. But being exposed to these other realities in the world that aren't just self-indulgent, not just about exploration, was actually very hard as well. To see the real impacts that, you know, it's different than reading about it, right? It either opens your heart or it closes it. And this is a war-ravaged population that has been so deeply impacted by landmines that, you know, these landmines killed less soldiers than they have people since then. But it's really interesting because this entire ecosystem has stayed safe because of the landmines left in the ground that are at the same time hurting the population. So it's this incredibly hard duality to stomach. One thing exists at the same time that the other does. So of course you can't ignore the humanitarian problem, but also if you take them out, you threaten the entire ecosystem. So what do? So our job was to find this river. We took Halo Trust, reinforced trucks through this old war zone, always looking for mines, following old military maps. And our job was then to descend the Quito River. You can actually see some of our little Makoros here. Because what this feeds is the Okavango Delta in Botswana, which is a huge beating heart of southern Africa that is also coincidentally built entirely by termites. Right? So termites, they eat stuff, they kill stuff, they eat it, and then they build their termitarium, which comes up, and as the water floods, 11 cubic kilometers of water floods every year. It brings sediment and it builds around these termitarium. The animals come sit on top, shit, grass grows, root infrastructure, and they grow the islands. So this is all built on death. And we thought we were just going to get in our canoes and float happily downstream. There was no stream, so we ended up spending the first 10 days dragging the Makoros, about 700 to 1,000 pounds, like a team of human dogs, through razor grass and all of that. And then we were really excited when we found the water and had to get in and start chopping the banks to make room. We weren't deciding, is it better to drag them or get in this? Some days when we dragged them, you could see where we started that morning. You could just look back and be like, oh, I forgot my hat. I'll go get it. Just walk back up there. And then when it actually opened up, then it was chopping through these incredibly overgrown mangroves and things like that. And then at this point, we're like, oh yeah, crocodiles. That sucks. I remember taking this photo of Steve. This is a swarm of sweat bees around him after getting out of the Makoro. And I looked at this picture on the back of my camera. I was like, that's a good one. And I opened my stat phone up to check for messages from my photo editor. And Sadie was just like, keep going. I know it's hard. And then there's this other message, and it's from my wife. And it just says, I've hired a lawyer. I'm like, okay, I know what that means. I know where this is going, and I've known it's going there for a very long time. Because if I'm honest, the speed of this life was a way to hide. And when I was on stage or when I was climbing, I could hide behind that person, right? But when the lights went down, when there was calm and quiet around me, the noise inside my head was so loud that I would do anything to calm it. And I started to drink a lot. But it was always sort of like, yeah, Cory, of course, having a drink, I'm home and I don't have a schedule, and lunch drink turned into a happy hour drink, turned into some dinner drinks, turned into the after. So that by then I'm having, 8 or 10 drinks a day. But nobody ever knows that I'm drunk, right? Just a little puffy. When I was on the road and I'm doing this, those drinks sort of grease those social wheels, and I started cheating, like a lot. It was pathological. Like my infidelity was profound. And this is not an excuse, by the way. I never want people to hear that. It was like desperately seeking some form of connection because I felt so disconnected from the world at the time. It was the only, it's not healthy. Again, it's not an excuse. It's all my responsibility. But I feel like it's really important to say those things out loud, because I also know that it's, as horrific as it is, it's human. But the thing is that, secrets are really the termites of love and intimacy, right? They eat at us. If we keep secrets, it's incredibly stressful for the brain to hold on to secrets and hide. And it grows that nervous system response. And it makes us always tense. And we're more in that fight, flight, or freeze. They literally eat at love and intimacy. And we start to separate from our loved ones because we feel unworthy of their love, right? And I started to see, as I looked around me, this connection to things. That life eats itself to survive. There's a Carl Sagan quote that says, if it can be destroyed by truth, it should be destroyed by truth. And in some ways, that's true of life itself, right? You look at the duality of things, landmines and protection. They exist at the same time, right? One thing kills something else in order to survive. Termites destroy and build a utopia. My past is always present, and my present is always my future unless I change something. And so long as I keep secrets and hide myself from the world, I will remain forever trapped by the things that haunt me, and it will just keep eating itself. And in order to sustain myself, I will eat myself. It is profound how much we can learn if we're just willing to look around ourselves. Everything is relational. One thing always defines another. But I really believe that if we're courageous enough and we start to look at those pieces that we deem unlovable, those can actually become the architects of refuge. If we reconcile with our darknesses, if we have the courage to look inside and go deep enough. But truthfully, I wasn't ready for that. I'm going a little long. Are you guys cool with that? You guys still engaged? If you need to get up and leave, I'll hate you, but it's fine. No, I'm just joking. So we came back from Africa, the divorce was finalized, and now that isolation was even more profound. I didn't know really how to navigate it. But there was always something to fill it. My friend Adrian called and asked if I wanted to go to Everest. And this had always been a dream. I always knew it was coming. But he was like, let's go to Everest. I know you're going through a hard time. I got a great idea. I was like, what's the idea? We're going to do it without oxygen, and we're going to put it on Snapchat. And I was like, oh, fuck, that sounds terrible. But I said, okay, let's do it. Just to give you guys some reference, some numbers from Dad, about 2 to 4% of people who climb Everest do it without oxygen. So just over 200 people have done that. And about almost 700 people have gone to space. So it's actually quite rare. It changes the game quite a bit. The move from base camp to advanced base camp is about 10.5 miles. It's 4,000 vertical feet, and it's this ridge, this rock ridge, that crawls up the center of these massive ice pinnacles. We call them penitentes, and they are almost like talisman. They're these sentinels watching over this valley. Go through the ice penitentes, and then you drop down and go around the shoulder of a mountain called Changsei, and right there we start to see our route. And it sort of creeps up on you. You can just see the top, then you can see more and more and more and more. And then you go around this final corner and you can see the whole thing. It's jaw-dropping. Everest is not the hardest mountain in the world to climb, but it is very dangerous because it is so high. Many people have climbed all the other 13 without oxygen, but can't get that last 300 meters done. Because climbing at 8,000 meters is basically like being on really great psychedelics. It's just very, very disorienting, strangely beautiful. Your senses are incredibly heightened, but to get to this point, you have to acclimatize quite a lot if you're going to be doing it without oxygen. So that means climbing high, sleeping low. Climbing a little higher, sleeping a little higher. And you do this yo-yo for about a month. And then when you're ready, and when you feel like you've been high enough, we tried to at least go above 8,000 meters, 26,000 feet, once, before we went all the way back down and rested. And when you're ready to go, you kind of just strap in and try. in a state of constant tension. So you don't really feel secure ever when you're on that kind of terrain. We got up onto one slope and it started to feel hollow. So we wanted to move across the slope. That entailed, climbing over this 2,000 feet of 50-degree ice. It's really heinous climbing. You're in this really awkward angle and it's too hard to take your ice axe and stab into it. If any of that ice gives away, you're just on sort of a 3,000-foot slip and slide. One mistake, if you're not perfect, you die. It takes a lot of energy to be perfect, but the problem with it is if you're not pretty darn close, the result is always in your face in this environment. Again, the reinforcement of and seeing death all around you all the time, it has an impact on your mind. At least it did on mine. On the morning of May 24th, we woke up very early, 11 o'clock at night, and left the tent. And as we started to climb, I noticed that Adrian was getting further and further behind me. It's the middle of the night. He's climbing with Pasong. And finally, I'm radioing back to him, and his words are getting slurred, and he's slowing down even more. And finally, I get this call. He's like, I have to turn around. I'm too cold. And I said, do you want me to come down? And the plan had always been if one of us was strong and the other was safe enough to turn around, the person who was strong would keep going. He said, no, I don't want you to turn around. And Monica, our base camp doctor, took over, and she said, Adrian, go down right now and put on oxygen as soon as you can find some, because you don't climb with it when you're doing it without. And then she's like, Cory, how do you feel? And I said, my left pinky tingles. And she goes, ooh, that's a sign. And I'm like, a sign? A sign of what? And she's like, being a bitch, keep going. Like, you're fine. So, but I'm sitting there, and it's the middle of the night, and I'm alone above probably 28,500 feet. There's nobody else on the route that day, maybe, a smattering of teams. And I just remember the silence of thinking, am I really going to do this? And I just said yes. I just trusted that it was going to work out. And I started climbing, and about 3 hours later, I passed this last team, and then I was there. And that's not garbage, everybody. Those are prayer flags. And I remember just thinking this awkward brain is like my brain is the highest point on the planet. That's weird. That's very strange. And nobody else was there. It's not one of those days where there's 100 people standing around selfieing. Instagram, I'm so cool. It's so hard. Selfie. And I just remember also having this terror that I had gone to the highest place on the planet in the hardest way I could figure out to do to get away from myself. And there was no place else I could go. There was no place else I could go. But I would not take that on for 6 years. And what happened directly after this was sort of a breaking point that still took me those next 6 years to unravel. I got home, and the noise, we got 2.5 billion media impressions. We were on Charlie Rose and CBS This Morning and doing this, all of this press because of the Snapchat stuff. And I just started to drink. I started to drink in a way that I had never really done before. And 6 months after Everest, I got assigned to do a story with Dan Buettner on happiness, of all things. And I was in Singapore, and I was sitting on the edge of my bed in a hotel room, and there was just mini bottles and the makeup of somebody I didn't know that I had just met, and she'd left, and I realized I got everything I ever wanted, and I've become somebody I never wanted to be. and I opened my laptop and I typed in rehab and I passed out. And a month later, I was in rehab, and I stayed there for about 30 days, and I learned a lot. But I also took on new stories. I took on the story of addict. I took on the story of powerlessness. I took on the story of, all of these new deficits, these new identities. And that became a new cage in some ways. And for 6 years, I called myself an addict. And for 6 more years, I kept going back to Everest to try to do the same thing. I tried to go back and do a new route. I tried to go back and make it harder. I tried to go back and make it more dangerous. Like, what could I do? How far could I finally outrun it? And then I started to see everything coming to a close. I got sent back by National Geographic to Pakistan to photograph the soldiers that had gotten me into the magazine in the first place. It was like a full circle. And then the next assignment was to Mustang, where they had sent me for my very first assignment. And I was watching all of these. I was aware that there was this something inside, and I felt like something is happening. This assignment was about the end of a dynasty. It was about the last king of Mustang. And it's the day we pulled into the river gorge, I got a call from my mom, and she said, "We need to talk." And I said, "Okay, great. Tell me what's up." And she said, "Your dad is sick. Your dad is dying, and he's going to die." I said, "What's the probability of survival of this cancer?" And Dad said 0%, but then he laughed because he was like, "Cory, the chance of survival was always 0. That's the probability that you're going to live forever." And then, as Dad was going into his journey with cancer, I lost my job at National Geographic. And that story is an incredibly complex one. It's in the book. I'm already way over time, but I'm almost done, I promise. And the only thing I could think to do was go back and try again. So we went to a mountain called Dhaulagiri, 7th highest mountain in the world. And I got to base camp. I stopped sleeping. I couldn't eat. I couldn't function. And my brain sped up to the point of sort of a mania that I couldn't keep track of my thoughts. And I remember sobbing in my tent and screaming into my sleeping bag because I didn't want anybody to hear, and just rocking back and forth and saying the word love. And I knew that something had broken, that I had to stop. And so the next day I got up and I told everybody that I was leaving, and we had a film crew in place, and we, hundreds of thousands of dollars spent, and they're like, "You're done?" And I'm like you're done with your coffee? And I was like, "No, I'm done climbing. I'm done taking pictures. What are you going to do?" And I'm like, "Move to LA and have a midlife crisis," which I did, by the way, and it worked out. But so I left and I came home, and then the depression hit. What this is a mixed bipolar episode, but it's being precipitated by the fundamental internal stress and knowing that I had exhausted this life. I was trapped by then. The thing that had created my freedom, the response to the cage of my childhood, climbing that freedom, had become another prison. Photography was keeping me trapped in this one form of creativity. I couldn't keep going, and I had known that for a long time, and it had finally fractured me. The stress of that, the denial of that internal knowing, which we so often know stuff for so long before we're willing to accept it, right? We try so hard to stay the same. We're always like, "I'm trying so hard to change." No, we're trying to stay the same because change is horrifying. We got it backwards. So I come home and I go into this depression. The New York Times writes an article about, like, should a mental health emergency derail a dangerous climb? And I'm like, the fuck? Like, is that a question, right? And that's when I really dove back into the mental health advocacy. But it was at the same time that in that aftermath, I got this email that was accusing me of escaping accountability and how I had this mass manipulation to do all these things. And now it's hiding behind bipolar and hiding behind these. And I was like, everything else in my life hasn't worked. So I'm going to end my life. It made perfect sense. It was so clear. Of course that's what I'm going to do. And I was like, I got plenty of climbing rope, and I got really close. And thankfully it didn't work. Yeah. And it was after that, coming out of that, that I felt, all that energy that I had put into these things started coming out as words. I didn't know what else to do. And the way I started examining my life was through the lens of the pictures that I had taken. And many times I would look at pictures like this, and it was as if I was seeing a moment for the first time, like I hadn't even been there. Like all of a sudden I was like, where was I? Where was I? And then I started looking at the pictures from the polls, and I realized that my life had literally mirrored my diagnosis. I had photographed from the Arctic to Antarctica, and everywhere in between. And I started thinking about diagnoses as containers. We live and die by the story of our diagnoses, and I realized that's actually false too. All a diagnosis is a word that describes a collection of behaviors, right? What stories had I picked up about this idea of bipolar and brokenness? And is it something actually to be cured? So I started looking back and thinking about all the stories that I had been telling about diagnosis, about mental health, about my past. Was my brother this abuser? Had I really been abandoned? Well, maybe abuse had happened, but also looking at the totality of it and how my brain had formed, he was the best thing that ever happened to me. Was bipolar actually harmful, or was it my greatest gift? If I wasn't, would I have done these things? So which story was true? That day in the hospital, I'm abandoned. The other story is I love my child so much that I am willing to separate myself from him in order for his wellness. All of these stories coexist all at once. And I started looking at all of them. And I realized that I had moved through life with such force. And people were always saying, you're so resilient. And I said, no, I'm not resilient at all. I've been living in survival my whole life, and they are very different things. Resilience is a response, survival is a reaction. Resilience is collective, survival is individual. Survival has no values. Resilience is slow, and it's underwritten by values. The storms are always going to come for us. They always do. But how we respond to them and the stories we tell about them, that's what defines who we are. It's all storytelling. Storytelling is consciousness. So I'm going to stop now, because you guys have hung with me for a long time. I'm going to tie it in a bow. Why do I get up here and talk about all of this complexity and the different things, bipolar and growing up on the street? It doesn't seem totally condensed, right? Well, life isn't. Life is messy. My belief is that it's my responsibility to share. It's not to celebrate this stuff. This stuff is only a way to bring people into the story. And my responsibility is to share in my entirety, to tell you the truth of what it really was, to tell you the truth about addiction and the way I saw it, to tell you the truth about needing validation and the misunderstanding that I was somehow fundamentally flawed, to tell you the truth about infidelity and divorce and my flaws. Because the idea is to invite people into their messiness and their wholeness, so we no longer hide. Storytelling is about inviting people into something that makes them feel less alone in their own path. And when we talk about mental health and we talk about destigmatizing it, we need to stop talking about curing it and start talking about managing it. It's not something to be cured. If you cure bipolar, wipe 90% of the world's greatest art off the earth. Take out Mozart. We don't want Mozart anymore. Van Gogh, it's all gone. This is not a fundamental flaw. I talk about all of it because I want people to feel seen in their totality. Everybody in here has a universe between their ears right now. Every single person, and it is huge. And the more we share, the more compassion we're invited into. I got asked last night by Dan if there were stars over Everest, if the sky was different. We tell stories in community. The invitation is to step into the fullness of ourselves. That's it. And we take agency over it. We don't hide behind our actions, but we don't hide our actions either, right? Because the point of this life, in my opinion, is not to avoid pain. Because if we let it, pain actually leads us back to one another. It's when we're in pain, when we suffer, that we come together. That's actually one of the greatest gifts. We're so obsessed with being happy all the time. Happiness isn't that's not the goal. The goal is the entirety of it. And when we're together, we're capable of overcoming pretty much anything. So I'm going to stop there, but I'm going to let you guys do something with me, I hope. If you don't do it, I can tell. I want everybody to close their eyes for a second. And I want you to take one hand and just put it on your heart. And just take a big, deep inhale. And prolong the exhale. Make it longer. And right at the bottom, just hold in that silence for a second. Just feel your body. Feel what it means to live in this body. And notice that right there, you are okay. Actually, everything is. And it always is right there. It's always okay. Right? You can open your eyes. When we find that place in us, we can always... You want me to get it? When we find that place in us, we can always go out of survival mode. The world is not, excuse my language, fucked. And we're so busy being told it is right now. They have us convinced that everything is scary. It's not. Everything is actually pretty much okay. And the more we can get out of that survival mode, the more we come together. And the more we find that compassionate. Oh, I'll still get it. It's fine. The more we can come together and solve the problems that are actually pushing us forward. So that's it. Thank you, guys. We're going to do a little Q&A.